A warm welcome to all of you joining us this afternoon, morning, evening, or night, as may be the case wherever you are in the world. As many of us are forced to come online or go digital for work, for our education, for meeting our day-to-day needs, or for hosting panel discussions, as the case here, societies, businesses, and governments will need to pay heed not just to creating more digital tools, whether it be e-bus passes or contact tracing apps, but also to consider and prepare for how certain groups and communities may be impacted or left behind in the process. So we need to consider questions like, how do we address social barriers to inclusion? What are the skills and infrastructure needed to get people online? And then to create spaces that speak to their experiences. And finally, do we have alternate pathways for those who are unable or unwilling to adopt digital tools? I am joined today by a panel of experts who have done a lot of work to both expand the theory, policy, and practice of digital inclusion. We have Keyzom Massally, who's the APAC lead for the Better Than Cash Alliance. We have Ephraim Kenyanito, who's with Article 19. Radhika Radhakrishnan, a feminist researcher. And finally, Lourdes, Montenegro, who's with the World Benchmarking Alliance. Before we start, just a quick housekeeping announcement. If you have any questions, please put them either in the chat or in the Q&A box. And with that, we'll start with the first speaker for this afternoon. Ephraim, what is your understanding of digital inclusion? What are the barriers to inclusion? And what, if any, are some examples of successful policymaking you have seen in this space? Over to you, Ephraim.
Thank you very much, Trisha. My definition of digital inclusion stems from the mandate which my organization, my institution comes from, Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Basically providing a space for people to have expression and access to information, regardless of who they are, where they're from, regardless of any of those barriers. So inclusion for me is trying to ensure that everybody is able to access those rights. So for me, my definition of inclusion is a rights-based approach. And that is the basic need for everyone across the world, for you to be able to exchange ideas, for you to learn, for you to be able to interact with everyone. That is the basic need. So some of the challenges that exist, one of the main challenges that exists a lot, especially in the developing world, is the challenge to access. So access to the infrastructure, access to the devices, and access to also policies that would enhance inclusion. So those three levels of access challenges. So apart from that, there's the other issue also, which also builds on from the access challenge to issues to do with, for example, the surveillance capitalism world that is building. So fortunately or unfortunately, how the world is being built, especially at the content layer of the internet, there is need for companies to monetize data, or they have tried to justify that being the need, or that being the business model, but trying to find alternative models. So segmenting to the third question, what successful measures that we are seeing? We are seeing companies moving, I'll delve into this more later into the conversation. We're seeing companies moving, for example, into human rights impact assessments, and that assessing the human rights, both human rights impacts both to their customers and to their employees and to their environments, and then that segmenting into them changing their policies. So after doing that kind of assessments, we are seeing companies changing policies and trying to adopt models which still respect rights, still ensure that everybody is included. And just still on that, that success bit, we've seen examples of companies such as Mozilla and others who slowly are trying to ensure that the web is open and accessible to everyone, despite their race, despite where they are in the world. So that would be my opening segment, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Ephraim, for setting the scene. I'll turn next to Keyzom. Could you talk to a little about your experience with Better Than Cash Alliance and really building and propagating some of these tools to encourage inclusion, especially for women?
Absolutely, Trisha, and thank you so much for having me, and hello to everyone. Trisha, approximately 1 billion women do not have access to digital payments. And I say this because it's a significant gap with multiplier negative impacts, as digital payments is a key enabler that's embedded throughout the digital economy. It is key to one of the aspirations of digital inclusion, which is economic empowerment. With the G20 Global Partnership of Financial Inclusion, we recently launched a report on women's access to financial services, where we found that though 240 million more women have access to financial services since 2014, those 1 billion excluded lack access to important tools to participate in the broader digital economy. And they are persistent barriers in access to identification documents, mobile phones that Ephraim just talked about in terms of access to devices, digital skills, financial capabilities, as well as the inappropriate products designed for them. And I think these are the fundamental foundational elements underpinning their exclusion. Now, across the Better Than Cash Alliance, our 75 members, they are taking very important steps towards this responsibility to close the gap. And India is, of course, a leader, as well as Colombia in Latin America. And we've seen this in COVID-19, where the cash transfers that they've done, they've been paid digitally into accounts of women. And this was only possible because of the prior investments they made in an inclusive digital public infrastructure for payments. In Indonesia and India, again, for example, we see that agents of digital financial service providers, they troubleshoot problems with women shop owners, help them download apps, link them to bank accounts, and really work with them to address some of the initial barriers to access. And after that, we see that women are more effectively able to use digital solutions for business purposes and for other personal needs. Another example is in March, when the government of Bangladesh announced a 600 million stimulus to pay workers' salaries in export-oriented sectors, which accounts for 80% of the country's exports, they initially encountered a major roadblock. Only 1.5 million of the 4 million workers, most of whom are women, were paid digitally because, and the rest only in cash, because they didn't have the accounts. They were not digitally included. However, the government, along with the private sector, demonstrated tremendous leaderships, and in just 25 days, 2.5 million women account opens were opened through mobile financial services. However, as my co-panelist has also said, much work remains in terms of achieving gender equality and digital inclusion. And in particular, even for those that are digitally included, Trisha, addressing their privacy and security dilemmas and building that agency for her to transact securely and grow. These are extremely important themes that we see across inclusion. And these are definitely the priorities of our work as we work together with our members across the Better Than Cash Alliance. Now, in the report that I just mentioned, and I hope everyone will have a chance to go to the G20 GPFI website and download it, there are 10 policy options that we recommend that are endorsed also by the G20 finance ministers to rapidly work towards digital financial inclusion for all women. And they address three main categories of barriers. One is that lack of access to basic requirements for inclusion, identity, handsets, etc. The second is limited digital financial infrastructure in terms of last mile delivery, in terms of consumer protection. And the last, which we often sort of don't consider when we work in our own respective domains, is that unequal laws and regulations, the systemic barriers of exclusion that still remain in many countries that will shape how digital exclusion also plays out. So these, I would say, are some of the policy options that are also articulated quite well, with lots of background research, empirical and data evidence that I would encourage everyone to also look through. Thank you, Trisha.
Thank you, Keyzom. And you brought up one really important element to access is the necessity of basic infrastructure and skills, like just having a bank account. These are things that are the necessary undergirding for a lot of the digital transformation that a lot of countries are aiming for. So now I will turn to Radhika. Could you speak a little to how marginalized communities experience these new digital tools, and then how can we deploy these technologies, or if we should, in contexts or communities that are not resilient or ready for them?
Thanks a lot, Trisha, for the introduction and for the question, and also to the panelists before me who've done a very good job of talking about the access gaps that I'll try to build upon in my remarks. I fully agree with what they've spoken so far. And for me, I want to add to that by saying that an important aspect of digital inclusion that I will focus upon is understanding the social context in which people exist in, and the social context of the data that is collected from them, and the interrelations and relationships between the bodies of these people and the data that is collected for them for the purpose of digital inclusion. And if we don't understand this, not only do we lead to exclusion, but it's going to reproduce various kinds of marginalizations that already exist in society. And I'm going to give you two small examples that are based on research that we're currently doing at the Internet Democracy Project, again, focused on COVID-19, to illustrate how these marginalizations get reproduced. So I'm going to also quickly share my screen to show you this. Okay, so if you can see here, during COVID-19, one of the state governments of Punjab in India, they implemented a particular app called the Ghar Ghar Nigrani app, which literally translates to house surveillance. And this was mandated for use by the accredited social health activists, or the ASHA workers, who are frontline workers, health workers in India, for going to houses in Punjab and collecting data of people. Now, this app had so many issues that the entire group of ASHA workers and their unions went on a protest against the use of this app. And I spoke to Ranjit Kaur, who is one of the leaders of the ASHA union, and she told me about the various issues that people were facing with this app that you can see on your screen here. So, for example, the first issue they had was related to access that we've been speaking about, which is that many ASHA workers who are women and who are also marginalized along locations of caste in India, they do not own mobile phones due to the digital divide. And when they brought up this issue with the government, saying that we can't use this app because we don't have phones, the government said that, why don't you then just borrow the phones of the male members in your family instead of actually providing them with this infrastructure? And there were other issues with the app, such as they were not provided any kind of digital training for the app. And as workers who were used to using manual forms for data entry, it took them significantly longer to fill in the data on the mobile phone, and the extra time that they needed to fill this on the mobile phone was not financially compensated by the government, because the context in which the ASHA workers were functioning was itself not well understood by the government at the point of implementing it. So you see that because of a lot of these kinds of issues, what was meant to be something that would help the ASHA workers ended up being something that made it more difficult for them to continue their own work. And these kinds of examples are aplenty. So for example, Keyzom spoke about the digital payments system in India, and I want to complicate that a little further actually, because uh, from our understanding in the study that we did, the reality of what actually happens at the grassroots level is very different from the claims made by the state for how these benefits are transferred. So when you have a direct benefit transfer and the government says that I will give people this much amount of money to your bank accounts, what is happening during COVID, for example, is that migrants who are stranded in a different state are entitled to receive a certain amount of this benefit into their bank accounts through these digital transfers. However, because of a lot of structural constraints, such as not only not having a smartphone to download the app to receive the money, they also don't know how to use the app. And I spoke to so many migrants who were stranded in places they had to borrow money, they were in debt because they were not able to make that journey back home because they were not able to receive the financial aid from the government. So for instance, we spoke earlier about how a lot of bank accounts were rapidly opened up during the Digital India initiative under the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana initiative. And what the problem of this is that we won a Guinness World Book of Records entry for the most number of bank accounts opened under the scheme. But during COVID-19 right now, women are not able to access money from these accounts because most of these accounts are dysfunctional because of the hurry in which the government implemented the scheme to reach these targets. So a lot of them got closed. They did not get linked properly to Aadhaar due to various reasons. Women are simply not able to access the money meaningfully. So you see that not understanding the context in which the technology is deployed really takes away from the kinds of benefits that the technology could have potentially accrued to people, especially when we're talking about marginalized groups of people and these kinds of inequalities. I also want to quickly talk about why this happens in the first place and why we're so tempted to use technology in these contexts. And I think that's because we think of technology as a kind of resource, as something that can be manipulated by humans for their benefit. And this is because we're constantly told that data is the new oil, for example. But when we start thinking of data as something that not only has harms to, for example, privacy or the information that is collected, but to the intimate bodies of people, as you see in these examples that I showed you. And when you see these links between data and bodies of people, then you start realizing that the issue is about personhood. It's about bodily integrity, autonomy, and dignity of individuals. And when you make policies with that as the starting point, you'll start taking these harms more seriously and not just think of them as very disconnected, disembodied harms about information that is just out there for human extraction. So if we start making policies with this framing in mind, I think we'd be able to better tackle these marginalizations going forward.
Thank you, Radhika. And an interesting set of questions, I think your comment also brings up, is sometimes the language with which a lot of these tools are promoted. And whether we should then be questioning whether those tools are actually achieving the goals they have been built for. And if they aren't, what are the actual aims that these technologies then ultimately have? Perhaps a different set of questions we can also ponder going forward. I'll turn now to Lourdes. We've talked about the scope of the problem and possible policy solutions. So Lourdes works with the World Benchmarking Alliance, and they are working on a tool to really measure how companies are integrating this concept of digital inclusion. And so Lourdes, over to you.
Thank you, Trisha. Very interesting insights from my fellow speakers as well. Hi, everyone. I'm Lourdes Montenegro. I lead the digital sector transformation work at the World Benchmarking Alliance. we've actually spent quite an amount of time thinking about what digital inclusion is, because if we want to measure something, then we have to define it quite clearly. And the exciting thing is this first week of December this year, we're coming out with a benchmark for all of the 100 most influential digital technology companies in the world, literally A to Z, Adobe to ZTE, comparing apple and orange, apples and oranges. So we really need to think about metrics. And I guess it starts with, what is digital technology, essentially? And it's a lot broader than we think. It's really about transmitting, storing, computing. So it's not just connectivity per se. It's everything digital, everything that can be made binary into zeros and ones, so in essence, if we define it that way, digital technologies are quite transformative. They are what we call in the scholarly literature general purpose technologies. They're disruptive, they're pervasive, they tend to be everywhere in all aspects of society, in all parts of the economy. They are constantly improving, and they will disrupt the way our world is organized, the way our lives work. So when we think, therefore, of digital inclusion, when that concept started, the notion of a digital divide began when the internet first made its appearance. It was quite narrow. It was, it started with the concern of the haves and have-nots of internet access. But then we need to really broaden the discussion and say, no, it's not just about connectivity. Connectivity is the foundation. It's very important, but it's more than that. So if we think of digital inclusion, there are actually, initially 4 parts of it. First is material access, not just to connectivity, but also to all types of digital technologies, which can include mobile payments, as Keyzom mentioned. It can include something as frontier as AI, for example. So it starts with material access, and income affordability affects that, of course. The availability of the infrastructure, the quality of the infrastructure available affects that as well. And then after access, people need to have the skills, the basic skills, up to the technical skills. But at the same time, you need to also ensure that your schools are wired up. They're also connected. You also need school connectivity, which improves general basic education for everyone. So people need to have the skills to transform this access into something beneficial. And then after that, then we might need to think of other barriers that, people might have the access, they might have the skills, but still they won't be able to benefit from digital technologies because they're afraid of privacy issues, that their rights are being not respected in that sense. So in that sense, digital rights and human rights become a fundamental input into inclusion, in a sense. So inclusion is a broader, more inclusive concept, in a sense. People might be concerned about security, cybersecurity, the content, the language, but also online risks and harms is broader than just security and risk. So one thing that we're looking at for our corporate benchmark, for example, is child online protection. How well are companies really devoting time, effort, and money into child online protection? Then finally, you've taken away all these barriers to use and people are benefiting. But then again, that's only one way. We're just assuming that everyone are users. The fundamental thing about digital economy is that it's all about innovation. And if we truly want to be inclusive, we need to be inclusive with the innovation as well. So that means we need to think about developing countries, that they have to be able to partake in this innovation, that people in vulnerable communities and are also able to partake of this innovation. So then we need to look at for example, how are companies distributing their R&D? do they have enough presence in developing countries, for example? Are they sharing the new oil, which is big data, with relevant, NGOs and government and different actors who want to analyze this data for social good to drive sustainable development? Are they looking at the ethics of technology development? Are they considering the implications on diverse groups? And for that to happen, you need to have a diverse group developing the technology as well. So you have enough women engineers, people of color from various ethnicities and income backgrounds. So and you need to invest in this technology innovation ecosystems, from not just commercial companies to social entrepreneurship as well. So the idea is, let's broaden this concept of digital inclusion, and let's not just look at access. Let's look at access to innovation and its benefits as well. So that's sort of our view on digital inclusion at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we're very excited to share that it's coming out this year, and we'll get a rank of these companies 1 to 100 who have demonstrated the most contribution to digital inclusion. Beyond, we need to take it back, of course, to the business models, but beyond that, are they willing to really spend time, money, and effort towards these issues as well? So it's a race to the top in a positive way for more inclusion. Thanks, Trisha.
Thank you, Lourdes. Really broadening again the concept of what digital inclusion is. As it is, it's still a concept that is still being developed, and I completely agree that we shouldn't just fix ourselves with one set of parameters and then just have that stick for eternity, but we should be like evolving our definition of digital inclusion to include a lot more than the basic things that we have addressed so far. So my next question is addressed to all of you who would like to take a crack at it. What do you all feel are some gaps in your countries and contexts in terms of, say, trust, or in terms of the impact of international tech giants or policy? What do you feel are some gaps in your context, and how would you like to see them addressed going forward? If Ephraim, would you like to start?
Sure, I can start. So thank you so much for that question. One big thing that is the current big debate, especially in my part of the world, is the issue of taxation, and how that is going to stream down to boost development to ensure more people are included. So this is a big thing. There is no one silver bullet for this, because over-taxation of these companies would disincentivize them from investing. For example, we've seen some companies starting to invest in boosting infrastructure. For example, we've seen Google trying to build infrastructure from the coast to Uganda through Kenya. We've seen those kind of the Facebook initiatives. We've seen some the balloons. I'm sure some of you might have seen the balloons which are going above Kenya right now, which is a new partnership between Telkom Kenya and Google and others. So trying to balance that kind of thing that they're trying to do to the community, and taxation is the next big thing that should be researched more about, and to ensure that there is tax justice for that, because the reason one of the reasons why I keep saying it's not a simple question is because the average revenue per user, ARPU, for most of these tech companies in the developing countries versus developed countries, it's less compared to developed countries. So that is a very big calculation that needs to be calculated when it comes to that question about tax. The other big question, I hope I'm not going too far, but the other big question is about content. So these big multinationals, the content that is being shared, the content that is being, the softwares, some of them don't have the languages of those, or even the content, the context of those places. For example, I'll give an example. Last month, there was a big, I think, movie or documentary released about Africa and Africans. It included a lot of Africans by Beyonce and a few celebrities in Hollywood. But then the most interesting thing was that it's not accessible in most of Africa, despite it being targeted towards celebrating African culture and African and Africa in general. So these are some of the big questions about the dynamics between big multinationals and the local sector, the tech sector, and that for me also goes back to the whole issue of inclusion. So by also us increasing access, which people are we including, which kind of cultures are we trying to push forward, which kind of languages, because we need to ensure that this space is open still for everyone and not just pushing or putting specific cultures and contexts into this space. So that's how I would answer briefly, but I'd be open to hear what others think about this, especially Radhika. Sorry to call on you, but your work on AI and minorities, I would be very curious to hear more about this. Thanks.
Radhika, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much for your response and for also expressing your interest in this work. Before I get to the AI, I actually wanted to respond to this by just slightly taking forward what I had ended my previous remarks with, which is the way we view data, because, we also in this webinar refer to data as the new oil. So I wanted to really, critically question that a little bit. So when you talk about gaps, I think one gap right now is just the framing and the way we view technology and data. Let's take the example of online violence, right? Because this is something that everyone is familiar with. Why is it that platforms are so lax when it comes to responding to women's complaints and reports about online violence, but we see a lot more sense of urgency when it comes to reports around physical violence of women? I think that's because we make that kind of a distinction between what is harm to data versus harm to the body. And this is not necessarily true in reality, because when we speak to women, and if someone's images have been non-consensually shared online, for example, we'll hardly hear women describe that in terms of harms to their data. You will always hear women describe that in terms of harms to their bodies and to their selves. So we see that how can data really be a resource if the control over data is experienced so intimately by people as control over their own bodies? So I think the current problem and a huge gap today in policy is that we still continue to view harms out of data as data protection harms, because we continue to view data as a form of resource that has a particular set of harms that naturally will be given lesser priority than harms to the body. I think if we need to take these concerns more seriously and affirm the lived experiences of people when they use these technologies and they want to be included on these platforms. Because as a woman, if I'm facing violence online, I will simply not want to engage with that online world. So my digital inclusion goes right away at that point. So we need to understand that policies have to be framed taking that into consideration and not making that distinction between unjustified access to data versus unjustified access to my bodies, because that's not how people experience it at the end of the day. And I think when it comes to AI, or when it comes to facial recognition, or when it comes to any kind of surveillance technology as well, we see this playing out in every single aspect, because at the end of the day, all these technologies currently form a ubiquitous form of power and a form of control over our bodies. And for us to recognize that that data is at the end of the day controlling our bodies is the missing link. So when we say even something like AI for social good, we don't really question whom that good is for. based on my ethnographic research on AI for social good, when I went to the places where these technologies were being implemented, the patients for whom the telemedicine and AI diagnostic tools were being used were not happy with the usage of that technology. They felt that they had no idea what was going on. They had no idea what was happening to their bodies in this process. But that is not recognized at the policy level, where technology is seen as that silver bullet panacea to it. And I agree that technology has a lot of benefits, a lot of emancipatory potential, but it is when we disconnect it from people's bodies that we begin to see the harms creep in. So maybe we can realize these potentials of AI, of all these technologies better, when we see these links and make these links in our policies.
Thank you, Radhika. And you identified a really important gap, and this you brought up in an earlier webinar as well, which is the state is defining what it means to be included in the digital economy, or what it means for a person to feel safe. And because it's the state making those definitions, the process for creating these frameworks needs to, in itself, be more inclusive and multi-stakeholder in that sense. I'll turn to Keyzom if you want to address the question I've addressed to all the speakers.
Sure. No, this is a very important conversation. And Radhika, thank you so much for these insights from the field and the grassroots, because I do think that, when we talk about digital inclusion, it cannot be talked about without that responsibility to the end user, or the last mile people, or, in Radhika's words, the individuals. And I think that agenda of responsibility in digital inclusion, including in, the work that I do with our members in responsible digital payments, is ever more important now, because while technology creates those great opportunities, it also creates that great divide and, a multiplier impact, negative impact on what it can do to harm people. So unless, digital solutions, digital inclusion is better than the status quo, it is not recommended. And that's why, even for us at the Better Than Cash Alliance, digital payments has to have a value proposition that's better than cash. Now, Radhika, to your point about, the COVID-19 cash transfers, and we've seen this across the globe, in many countries where people struggle to receive the cash transfers when they were paid digitally even, right? But I think it's also important to reflect on, the journey sort of where up until then, in terms of at least, the middle people, the graft, the corruption, the ghost, beneficiaries, etc., in a system, which is I think what some of the initial aspirations or ambitions of many of the Better Than Cash Alliance members have been. Now, when we look at a crisis and the unique situations of it, I think there is definitely a great opportunity to play a more proactive and iterative role in ensuring that people are not the ones struggling. People are not the ones that are, faced with challenges of digital inclusion. And I think that's, really important for all of us as, practitioners, as researchers, as well as in terms of, working with that large state that's defining the rules of the games. At the same time, has a huge responsibility in terms of engaging, at the grassroots, but also with the private sector, with the innovators, to ensure to, maintain that balance that ultimately results in, great inclusive progress across the board.
Thank you, Keyzom, and thank you also for identifying another important issue, which is the need for dialogue between government, private sector, industry, and civil society. I'll turn next to Lourdes to answer the question.
Thanks, Trisha. Thanks, everyone, again. Lots of food for thought. So when you think about gaps, I mean, that's what we're here for. There are more gaps actually than filled gaps, so they remain, they continue to remain. And that's largely because the digital sector is young, digital technologies are new, and we're still keeping up in terms of policy. So the the digital inclusion benchmark that the World Benchmarking Alliance is publishing before the end of the year actually fills a very important gap. A lot of companies have made commitments saying that private sector plays key role in sustainable development and in achieving all this SD 17 sustainable development goals, but there's no accountability mechanism. And that's the scary thing, because we're now in a world where we have a lot of these digital technology companies that are too big to fail, in a sense that they essentially overshadow government efforts in the space. They have the capital, they have the know-how, essentially a lot of the expertise and the capital and the workforce. And therefore, the ability to actually invest and drive transformative changes in this space is in the hands of the private sector. Even infrastructure, which has been, we've gone through decades of privatization, and now our telecommunications connectivity infrastructure, a lot of it is in the hands of the private sector as well. So there's a lot of things that the private sector is increasingly responsible for, but are not accountable for. And therefore, that's why we're here. We want to provide that kind of accountability mechanism, and we encourage civil society, government actors, and as well as investors. We also work with investors to make sure that the data is used to engage, to incentivize, to pressure companies to do more and to do well, to actually be in a sense positive contributors to sustainable development, of which digital inclusion is a cross-cutting enabler. So that's actually one of the big gaps that we're trying to fill. And as Ephraim mentioned, really loved it when he mentioned the issue of taxation. We do have an indicator on that, and it's whether companies are declaring their economic value contribution, because very and it's sad to say, sneak peek on the data, very few companies do. So we don't know how they are actually contributing in all the various jurisdictions where they are getting value from. So again, I mean, that's another big gap. We can talk about like basic access issues that are very basic and we must address, but there are also a lot of scary things in the horizon that that have not yet gained enough traction in the public discourse. So for example, if you think about automation and artificial intelligence, the issue is not just about algorithmic bias. This is a very Western framing, but it's really what happens to developing countries who are trying to industrialize. What happens when they don't have that ladder of industrialization, of development anymore? So I guess another gap is to bring back the discussion to our points of view as people from developing countries, from the global South, and to make our voices heard.
Thank you, Lourdes. So if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat and Q&A box. There is one question from Archit, which I believe is directed to Radhika. Digital inclusion in the education sector is suffering from a lack of dialogue between different ministries. Okay, I think many of you could address that, between the education and technology ministries, and turf wars create a policy gap and barriers that Lourdes has mentioned. How do you think this disconnect between different parts of the government can be addressed?
Can I respond partly to it? Okay, so I don't think I'd be able to do justice to this to all parts of this question. So I welcome all the other panelists to also chip in. Based on my limited understanding of how this works, I think currently in the past few years in India, if you look at the way the education sector has worked, and since we're talking about digital inclusion in today's webinar, there have been a lot of efforts to introduce technology within the education sector. It could be through AI, and it could be through even more basic forms of technology, such as last year or a few years ago, the Delhi government had proposed that CCTVs would be implemented in all schools in Delhi. And this was aimed at reducing bullying, or to basically help parents keep an eye on their children when they were in school. Now, this is actually a really problematic proposal, because just think of it, if you're a queer student, if you're a girl child around the age of puberty in that classroom, and for you home is not the safe space, school is the safe space away from your home, and you've really escaped your home to go there, and now you have that eye always upon you, tracking you, looking at what you're doing. So a lot of the, and very interestingly, a lot of the funds for these kinds of proposals have been implemented with the justification of quote unquote safety for women. The funds come from, for example, the CCTVization that's being noticed has come from the Nirbhaya funds of the government, which are funds that were allocated for the safety of women after a particular gang rape case took place in India. But what happens is that when you have initiatives such as CCTVs for the safety of women, it really incentivizes women to just change their behavior when they are being watched by the CCTV within the classroom, for example, in the space of education. It does not actually help in reduce crime. It does not actually help in creating a safe environment, because you can't ask people to change their behavior to keep themselves safe. That is a form of victim blaming. You have to make the environment itself safe for the person to be able to exist within. So again, this also in fact is a way of not understanding the context in which the technology is deployed. So I think especially this is something we're seeing a lot within the education sector, as within a lot of other sectors, to be honest. But I'm not really sure about the dialogue between the education and tech ministries, but I am seeing these forms of collaboration between tech providers and the education space, and we're seeing that this is not actually benefiting people, and that is one gap that I can respond to, but I would welcome the other panelists if they'd like to chip in where I've fallen short.
Trisha, I was only just going to say that, on top of Radhika's comments, the only thing that I know of, given that I also have 3 children, is that there's been a lot of talk about, access to education in this COVID-19 pandemic. And there are so many children without access to internet, access to, laptops or iPads or whatever that may be the device. And therefore their education has suffered in this pandemic. And I think that gap is very real and being felt, across the board in terms of the next generation of, students coming up, and there will be long-term impacts. So I do think, that it's a really important agenda item as a parent, speaking as a parent, and really, worried about those that don't have access. But of course, as Radhika, the activist amongst us, reminds us, it has to be done responsibly and in ways that, doesn't blame the victim, but rather solves the issue at hand.
Thanks, Keyzom. Yes, I mean, there are concerns as to whether the pandemic is going to bring us back to square one on the education gap, especially based on socio-economic divides. Lourdes, did you have something to say on this?
Not really much, as I might be not understanding most of the context to the question, but all I can say is that there's no easy answer. And when you think about it, an all-around good education policy that reaches the most number of citizens is also the best answer actually to our digital skills gap. So it really starts fundamentally with a very solid education policy.
Thanks, Lourdes. And just to go back to Archit's question, I mean, I think a lot of, it's not just the education and tech sector in terms of gaps between ministries in India. You see that in a lot of sectors, including AI, emerging technologies. Even within ministries, the MEA has so many divisions that tackle one corner of the issue. And that's something that perhaps requires a much broader solution than just bridging the gap between two ministries. There's another question in the chat, which is in the context of digital payments. So it's directed to Keyzom, which is in addition to expanding access to digital payments, has there been any consideration given to also prevent identity theft or lesser cyber hacks? And if there are any points you would like to highlight in relation to this?
Sure, and Ruhana, thank you so much for listening in and for that question. The Responsible Digital Payments Guidelines says that people should have access to their funds in any digital payments accounts. So really, the principle behind that guideline is that if there's an if there's a theft of your funds, for example, it's not the responsibility of the person, but rather the responsibility of that financial sector in terms of being able to make sure that you are not the one who is, the only one running after helplines and trying to get your funds back, but rather the onus is on the providers, the onus is on the regulators, or onus is on the broader ecosystem. So, from that point of view, I think, the principle really behind sort of the considerations around cyber hacks, etc., is really that these things will happen. Digital inclusion is not hack-proof. They're going to happen, but it's about also how do you address that responsibility, who do you pin the blame on, and how do you really sort of make sure that it's not people who are losing their identities or trust in those scenarios.
Thank you, Keyzom. We have about 7 minutes left, so we can just go around the virtual table, and if you guys would just take 2 minutes to put in any concluding remarks you have or points you feel have not been addressed so far. Ephraim, I will start with you.
Thank you so much, Trisha. Just concluding remarks that I would say is let's build the infrastructure from like the initial steps, thinking of everyone, trying to include everyone right from the beginning, and not to come up with post solutions once we've messed up. So that's a call. It's a very big responsibility for both governments, companies, and everyone to think of the institutions, of trying to ensure that their institutions, the products that they're being built are as inclusive right from the beginning as possible. That's why we have been trying to push for human rights impact assessments. We've done this now at the infrastructure level with a couple of companies, internet registries and registrars, and we hope such kind of assessments will be done right from the beginning instead of afterwards, post fact, to remedy issues, but more right from the beginning and then building it from there, so that in case there's any mistakes that happen, these are corrected all through, instead of being reactive, being proactive. That's the parting shot that I would keep urging, because there's a lot of technologies that will keep being developed in developing countries, because we have like more and more opportunities for innovation to fix most of the issues that we have that have not been addressed or that have not been fixed by the other technologies that are being pushed to the developing countries markets or the global south. I think that's my parting shot. Thank you so much, Trisha. Thank you so much, everyone. I have really enjoyed this panel.
Thank you, Ephraim. Keyzom, would you like to go next?
Sure. Just to express that it was such a privilege to have such diverse views on this panel and such great questions. So thank you for having me, Trisha. And really the, parting remarks is a reminder that approximately 1 billion women don't have access to responsible digital payments. And that's something I think that, I take as part of my aspirations and my contributions, and a lot of people who are working on it to really close this gap and make sure that access is better than the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you, Keyzom. Radhika and then Lourdes.
Thank you, Trisha, once again for having me on this panel. It's been great listening to everyone and learning about different contexts, different viewpoints. So thanks for that. And also thanks for all the questions and the opportunity to really think a little bit about it as well. So in conclusion, I think I'm just going to reiterate the main takeaway of what I had hoped to bring to the table today, which is the work that we're doing at the Internet Democracy Project, which is looking at data as bodies and to understand that in a datafied world that we currently live in, that distinction between the body and data is increasingly blurring. And unless we take that framing into consideration and frame policies around that, we're going to leave behind a lot of people, and those people are mostly going to be marginalized communities, because when data is disembodied, it hides the power relations that data always exists within, and it sort of makes it seem like everything is equalized. It makes it difficult to pinpoint specific harms that are accrued, and often the people who do face these harms are not in a position of influence to be able to change that, which is why when policymakers have that influence and have that power, it's important to take into consideration what really we're talking about when we're talking about harms and we're talking about data harms, and when digital inclusion is leaving out certain people, what kinds of experiences and what kinds of contexts those experiences are occurring within. You can also follow our work. I can send my email address as well as the website of our organization on the chat box, where we keep updating progress from our research, and hopefully one of the papers that I'm writing about this should be out by next month. So I also encourage everyone to read that if you found some of this interesting or would like to maybe just question it or engage with it a little bit further. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Radhika. I think the phrase to summarize your point would be all data is personal data, essentially. Lourdes, you have the last word.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. So thanks, Trisha and Observer Research Foundation for organizing this, and we're so happy to collaborate. So on that note about collaboration, so I end with a call for collaboration. Essentially, if we want to drive positive change in the digital system, if we want to create a trustworthy, a secure digital economy and society that leaves no one behind, then we need to work together as different stakeholders, especially civil society. We need to increase civil society voices. So the benchmark that we are publishing by end of this year, the digital inclusion benchmark by the World Benchmarking Alliance, is a tool. It's just a tool to empower people and to empower advocates of digital inclusion. So we invite you to watch out for the results that's coming up. Download and read the methodology report. I've sent the link in the chat box. We're very happy to have your inputs and your views and on ideas on how we can collaborate and build a movement around a truly inclusive digital inclusion agenda. So please get in touch, info.digital@worldbenchmarkingalliance.org. You can address it to me. We'd be happy to have your views. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Lourdes, Keyzom, Ephraim, Radhika, for joining us this afternoon and for your amazing inputs. And thank you to everybody who has been a part of this conversation. I wish you all a pleasant week ahead.